Newborn humans are remarkably helpless. A foal can stand and walk within the first hour of its life. Baby giraffes are on their feet in under 30 minutes. Sea turtles crack through their shells alone on an open beach and immediately race toward the water, while predatory birds dive at them from above. A human newborn, by comparison, cannot even lift its own head. Leave a newborn human unattended for just a few hours and it will not survive. It cannot walk, cannot speak, cannot find its own food, cannot keep its own body temperature stable, and for the first several months of life, it barely registers that it exists as a separate being from its mother. From the standpoint of evolution, this looks less like a design and more like a catastrophic oversight. And yet humans became the most successful species this planet has ever produced. We raised cities from the ground. We built aircraft and nuclear weapons and spacecraft capable of landing on other worlds. But somehow the opening chapter of our existence looks less like a functioning animal and more like a soft, confused vegetable. So what actually happened here? Why are human infants so profoundly, almost embarrassingly vulnerable compared to virtually every other creature alive? The answer begins with a problem so fundamental that evolution essentially had to perform emergency surgery on our biology just to keep the species going. That problem is the human brain. The adult human brain weighs roughly 3 pounds. It burns through approximately 20% of the body's total energy output despite accounting for only a tiny fraction of overall body weight. Compared to every other primate on Earth, the human brain is wildly, almost absurdly oversized. And it is precisely that oversized brain that gave our species the capacity for language, for long-range planning, for tool use, for culture, and ultimately for everything we would go on to build. But the moment that brains started growing larger, evolution ran directly into a wall, because Barbies have to exit the body somehow. For millions of years before any of this became a problem, early human ancestors moved on 4 legs. Their hips were shaped more or less like those of other great apes. Birth was difficult, as it always is, but it was biologically manageable. Then, somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, our ancestors stood upright. That single change completely restructured the human pelvis. A pelvis designed for efficient 2-legged walking is narrow and bowl-shaped. That geometry works beautifully for movement and balance. It works terribly for pushing a large-skulled infant through the birth canal. Anthropologists gave this conflict a name, the obstetric dilemma. 2 evolutionary advantages that humans developed ended up working directly against each other. Bigger brains, narrower hips. At some point, evolution simply could not satisfy both demands simultaneously. A baby's skull was becoming too large to pass safely through the canal that the upright pelvis had created. And so the solution that emerged was not to make the skull smaller or the pelvis wider. The solution was to get the baby out sooner. Human Barbies, compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, arrive in a state of profound developmental incompleteness. Not premature in the clinical sense that modern medicine uses the word, but premature in every meaningful biological sense. A foal arrives ready to run because its development inside the mother had the time to reach a more functional stage. A newborn chimpanzee, by comparison to a human infant, is impressively capable. A human newborn, on the other hand, enters the world with a brain that is nowhere near finished. If human infants were to remain in the womb until their brains reached the level of development needed to support independent function, a human pregnancy would not last 9 months. It would last somewhere between 18 and 21 months, and at that gestational stage, the infant's head would be completely impossible to deliver through the human birth canal. Evolution found itself stuck, and so it arrived at a compromise that sounds almost reckless when you say it plainly. Get the baby out early, finish building it on the outside. Improbable as that sounds, it worked. Human infants are essentially external fetuses for the first year of life. Enormous portions of brain development that take place before birth in other species continue happening outside the womb in humans. It is the reason newborns sleep as much as they do. The brain is expanding and reorganizing at an extraordinary rate, roughly doubling in overall size across the first 12 months alone. But unlike virtually every other animal, a human baby does not arrive with a complete operating system already installed. It arrives with the capacity to build one, and that distinction turns out to matter enormously. A newborn deer knows how to stand. A spider constructs a web with no instruction. A bird does not require lessons in aerodynamics before its first flight. Across the animal kingdom, a vast amount of behavior comes preloaded, hardwired instincts that activate on schedule without any need for learning or experience. Humans took a fundamentally different path. Rather than encoding behavior into fixed instinct, evolution made the human brain almost painfully flexible. A human infant's brain arrives unfinished because it is waiting to be shaped by whatever environment it finds itself in. Language, cultural norms, social behavior, tools, survival strategies, none of this comes pre-installed. All of it is downloaded after birth, from the world the child is born into. In the broadest possible terms, humans traded instinct for learning, and learning demands something instinct does not time, a great deal of it. This is why human childhood is so bizarrely extended compared to nearly every other species. Humans remain dependent for years. In many hunter-gatherer populations studied by anthropologists, children do not reach genuine self-sufficiency until their late teenage years. From a purely efficiency-focused evolutionary standpoint, investing years of food and protection into a creature before it contributes anything sounds like an unsustainable arrangement. But humans were never optimized purely for survival. Humans were optimized for adaptation. And adaptation, it turned out, was the most powerful strategy any species had ever stumbled into. A wolf raised in Siberia and a wolf raised on the Spanish plains behave in the fundamental ways that matter, like wolves. A human raised in a desert, a rainforest, a frozen tundra, a megacity, or a remote Pacific island absorbs an entirely different framework for existing in the world and functions within it. That flexibility flows directly from the unfinished brain that a helpless human infant carries into the world. But arriving helpless created an entirely new category of problem. If the infant cannot protect or feed itself, and cannot cling to a parent the way infant monkeys grip their mother's fur, then who keeps it alive? Most species resolve this simply. The mother handles the early weeks or months, and then the offspring transitions to independence. Human infants made that arrangement impossible. The demands they place on caregivers are relentless in a way that has no real equivalent among our primate relatives. Human Barbies cry more. They wake through the night repeatedly. They require constant carrying, constant feeding, constant physical contact and warmth. The burden they represent is, by any honest measure, extraordinary. And it may be precisely that burden that changed the structure of human society. Anthropologists studying traditional hunter-gatherer communities noticed a pattern that does not appear in other great apes. Humans raise their young collectively. Grandparents contribute. Older siblings take on caregiving roles. Fathers remain involved in ways that are unusual among primates. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and even unrelated community members participate in raising children who are not biologically theirs. Researchers gave this pattern a name: cooperative breeding. The human infant is so demanding to keep alive that the species effectively turned early childhood into a community project. Some researchers believe this shift had permanent consequences for human psychology. The deep social intelligence, the capacity for empathy, the instinct toward cooperation that distinguishes humans from other apes, all of it may have roots in the simple practical problem of keeping an impossibly needy infant breathing through the night without an entire support network around it. Your brain's remarkable social architecture may exist, at least in part, because your ancestors were exhausting Barbies. And then there is one more thing about human infants that tends to get overlooked in these discussions. They are, almost universally, considered extraordinarily cute. That observation sounds trivial. It is not. In the 1940s, an ethologist named Konrad Lorenz identified a cluster of physical features that appear in human infants and reliably trigger caregiving impulses in adult humans. He called it the baby schema: disproportionately large eyes, round, full cheeks, a small nose, a large, forward-projecting forehead. These proportions, Lawrence argued, function as a kind of biological signal, one that activates nurturing instincts in the adult brain automatically, regardless of whether the adult has any prior experience with children or any particular desire to care for them. Evolution, in other words, weaponized cuteness. The reasoning is not hard to follow. A species whose infants required years of intensive care from adults who received nothing immediate in return faced an obvious vulnerability. If exhausted parents, operating under conditions of scarcity and constant physical demand, found their infants neutral or unappealing, the species would have been in serious trouble. Making infants irresistible to adult human brains was a solution. Even with that evolutionary upgrade in place, raising human children remains difficult enough that adults across every culture and era have found occasion to complain about it at considerable length. But here is perhaps the strangest reversal in this entire story. The helplessness that makes human infants so demanding, the profound incompleteness that requires years of protection and investment, may be the direct cause of human intelligence rather than its consequence. For a long time, the standard assumption was that intelligence came first, and the extended childhood that followed was simply something it made possible. More recent research suggests the relationship runs the other way. Long childhoods may be what creates intelligence. When a developing brain spends years in active engagement with the world, playing, experimenting, making and correcting errors, absorbing language and social patterns and physical principles, rather than relying on pre-encoded instinct, it develops capacities that a brain running on fixed hardware simply cannot reach. Play in this framework is not a luxury or a distraction. Play is the mechanism. Children learning to navigate social situations through games, testing physical principles through interaction with objects, practicing language through endless repetition and improvisation. All of it is the brain running simulations, building models, preparing for a range of futures that no fixed instinct could anticipate. Other species engage in forms of play. Humans extended the practice to an extreme that no other animal approaches, and it traces back, in a direct line, to an evolutionary compromise made millions of years ago when a brain grew too large for the body trying to deliver it. Our brains became too big, our hips became too narrow, and the resolution evolution found was to send humans into the world more unfinished than any other animal and let the world do the rest of the work. Every civilization humans have ever built, every scientific discovery, every work of art, every system of law, every instrument of war, every vessel that has left the atmosphere, all of it originated in a species whose newborns cannot survive a single night without assistance. The most dominant creature this planet has ever seen begins its existence completely, utterly helpless, not because evolution made an error, but because that helplessness turned out to be the price of something far more valuable than an early start. Time to learn, time to adapt, time to become something the world had never seen before.